This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 3.3, Part B, on the war between the states, or the Civil War. And where we had left off was in 61 and 62, we see that the Union suffers a series of tactical defeats. Lee parleys this into an offensive into the north at Antietam, and that's where we left off the last one. Well, the Battle of Antietam is kind of one that there's not a lot of consensual agreement on. There are those who feel, myself included, that Lee really won a tactical victory because the Union had a numerical superiority and he held them at bay, but it was at best a Pyrrhic victory. Lee felt that after the battle at Antietam, he lacked sufficient force to continue the campaign in the north, and so he'll fall back south. And this makes Lincoln think that Lee is vulnerable, and so he'll find someone to prepare an offensive once again into the South. And who he plunks for this is Ambrose Burnside, a notorious drunk, and an extraordinarily, as we're going to see, an extraordinarily bad strategist and tactician. And under Burnside, the Union's going to suffer its most major strategic and tactical defeat of the war. Burnside, in typical fashion, Ambrose Burnside is not known for his creativity, will attempt in large part to repeat what has been done twice at the battles of Manassas, and of course, as Einstein tells us to do the same thing over and over and over and expect different results is one of the sure signs of insanity. But we won't go there. So he's going to try an over the top, up front offensive to pummel through Confederate forces. Now, in his defense, after Antietam, the belief is, and the belief has been all along, that Lee just lacks sufficient strength to withstand the Union assault. Now, Burnside's campaign, which will end up at the Battle of Fredericksburg, is doomed from the very beginning. Okay, and we see here, you see when it's planned, the late fall of 62 through really the end of December of 62 and January, so the winter of 62-63. This is in northern Virginia. And I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but it's very much like Pennsylvania in the fall. It rains incessantly. And so one of the things Burnside's going to have to deal with is a successive series of operational delays that make it impossible for him to really make any headway. And while he's doing that, Lee is rallying his forces and reassembling his army for a defense at Fredericksburg. Now, the other problem that Burnside's going to face is, if you look here, you see just a host of rivers and tributaries, most of them with the Rappahannock. The Bull Run is one of those. Okay, that's where the Battle of Manassas was. Well, Burnside's plan on how to logistically support the army and get over those rivers is, at the very best, somewhat dubious. His plan is to carry with him 190 wagons worth of pontoon bridges that will float on the rivers, that you'll put end to end, hooked together, and then the army will be able to cross. And essentially then what he's going to do is a game of Frogger. He's going to leapfrog from river to river and river. Okay, placing himself each time at a strategic vulnerability, a tactical vulnerability, which, if Lee were able to rally his forces, he would be able to exploit. Lee will finally wait until Burnside attempts the crossing at Fredericksburg to finally contest the issue, where he has the greatest tactical advantage. And so there's going to be nothing but delays in this. Now, we'll take a look at the battle here in a minute. Now, okay, the forces are aligned at Fredericksburg. Now, in addition to the kind of tactical or strategic logistical mistake that Burnside makes trying to march through northern Virginia in the middle of fall and early winter, I mean, it takes him 2 months to get there, okay, with an enormous baggage train, including 190 wagons worth of pontoon bridges, which he continually leapfrogs from river to river and river. He finally arrives at Fredericksburg. Now, the second of his mistakes is a lack of scouting intelligence. He fails to adequately scout Lee's army. He believes that the main part of Lee's army is south on the Rappahannock, south of Fredericksburg here. In point of fact, that's not the case. This will generally come under the command of Stonewall Jackson. He believes that Fredericksburg is defended by Lee's far left flank, and so is undergunned and undermanned, and so he'll position his main body directly across here at Stafford Heights, directly across from Fredericksburg, with the intention of pummeling through, turning Lee's left flank, and then encircling the main army. Okay, had he actually scouted across the river, he would have seen that, in fact, Lee's main army is just west of Fredericksburg at a place called Mary's, brilliantly positioned by Lee, I might add, on Mary's Heights, awaiting the Union assault. Now, that's problem one. Problem two that Burnside faces and completely ignores is he has to, first of all, his army is going to have to be delayed here and wait in another series of operational delays while the baggage camp carrying the pontoon bridges makes its way from further north, which they will. Okay, they will on December 11th. Burnside orders the pontoon bridges to be set along the river and for his army to cross to overwhelm the Confederates on Mary's Heights. Okay, who he doesn't know actually are in Mary's Heights, and he underestimates their strength. Lee, for his part, plays a delay. He decides to spring a trap. He's going to allow, for the most part, Burnside to begin laying out his pontoon bridges, which he does in the middle of the night. Burnside is going to begin laying out the pontoon bridges right around 0100. Okay, at 0500, which is not quite the crack of dawn yet. We're in December, so days are a little bit shorter, so it's not quite the crack of dawn. Dawn's about an hour and a half away. Lee orders his artillery and his snipers to open up on the engineers, okay, to destroy the bridges. This is really little more than a harassing assault on Burnside. He doesn't intend on preventing Burnside from crossing altogether. In fact, what he wants to do is have Burnside cross and make his way in so that he'll be literally pummeling himself, to essentially beat his head against the wall at Mary's Heights. But some display is necessary because Burnside expects it, and as Sun Tzu says, you always want to give the enemy what they expect to see. If to reference back real quickly, if you'll recall, that was what Daniel Morgan did at Hannah's Cowpens. We won't get into it in any detail. You can go back and look at it at your leisure. That's in the Revolutionary PowerPoint. Now, sure enough, at 0500, he'll do that. Now, Burnside, for his part, will use his artillery on Stafford Heights to drive back Lee's artillery and snipers to allow the forces to cross. Now, this is a screenshot, obviously, from History Animated, and I encourage you to go there and take a look at the battle itself. Burnside in this battle is going to really demonstrate his limitations as a commanding officer, both tactically and strategically, in a series of frontal assaults, all of which will be piecemeal and uncoordinated. Burnside is going to send brigade after brigade after brigade to crash their heads against the wall at Mary's Heights. Literally, it's a stone wall behind which sits dozens of pieces of Confederate artillery and thousands of Confederate troops, Lee's main army. Okay? And he will do this for the entire day of December 11th. Okay? And having failed to take the position, he's convinced that, well, he was almost through. So on December 12th, he will attempt yet another assault. Okay? Now, meanwhile, this force down here will come across the river, okay, and lightly assault this. This, remember, is where Burnside thinks Lee's main army is, so he doesn't want to risk a direct confrontation with it. He is convinced that the key to the contest is still to turn what he believes is Lee's left flank at Fredericksburg. This allows Lee, and it's actually under Jackson, that reinforcements will come and make it still more difficult for Burnside ultimately to break through. And after a series of full frontal assaults, on the 13th, Burnside's generals finally convince him that to continue the contest is futile and foolish, and Burnside's forces will simply have to slip away at night. And the Confederacy will achieve a decisive victory against the Union, and then we'll go into Chancellorsville. Following the disastrous battle at Fredericksburg and the disastrous campaign, once again, as we've seen before, the Union will withdraw back north of the Potomac, reassemble its army, rally, and attempt yet again a frontal assault. And Burnside will be replaced because Burnside demonstrates emphatically his incompetence as a commander. So Lincoln will, in this continuing revolving door of commanders of the Army of the Potomac, will once again replace him, this time with Hooker. And Hooker's a little bit better tactician and a little bit better strategist, but he's still not going to be a match for Lee. Now, Hooker's idea, you see Hooker's plan here, and Hooker's idea is to largely move in the same direction as Burnside and the same direction as the battles at Manassas, but with a little bit of a twist. Hooker's plan is to move south, and again, more or less at Fredericksburg, which is right here, place a contingent to pin Lee's army down. Lee will then believe that Hooker, like his predecessor, will plan on crossing the Rappahannock, taking Fredericksburg and moving south. So he'll have a small force here to distract Lee's force. His main body will proceed in a rather complicated encirclement movement designed to encircle Lee's army. And the key to it is this guy up here, Stoneman, who's in charge of the cavalry. What Hooker envisions is he wants Stoneman to go way south of Confederate forces to a place called Hancock, right down here, where the junction of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad is. Stoneman's cavalry's job is to tear up the tracks, okay, in the famous song from the band, Stoneman's cavalry came and tore up the tracks again. This is what that's based on. Stoneman, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down is the name of the song from the band, okay? Robbie Robertson, look it up, Google it, YouTube it, listen to it. It's a great song. Okay, at any rate, classic rock, wonderful. Okay, at any rate. Stoneman's to come down here and tear up this junction. Now, if he does that, what Hooker's planning is, if he can do that, then Lee will be unable to reinforce the position and unable to resupply his army. He will then be faced with one of two options. Option one, fight a battle in a tactically inferior position against superior numbers, okay, encircled by two Union armies, or two, withdraw, in which case the Union will take the position, which is the same position Burnside wanted, from which they can then launch their assault on Richmond. Okay? Makes sense. It's a good plan on paper. But there are problems from the outset. Problem number one, Stoneman's cavalry misses the mark. Instead of hitting Hancock, they move further south and tear up only one railroad track. The remainder remain intact from Richmond, and so throughout the battle, Lee is able to both reinforce and resupply his army. Okay, that's the first mistake. The second mistake is this maneuver of the Union Army to encircle, okay, from the west up by Chancellorsville, okay, which is where the battle gets its name, is a very complicated maneuver involving very precise movements across several different rivers. And as a result of this, there will be operational delays that delay the assembly of Hooker's forces south of the Rappahannock. Okay, this gives Lee and Thomas Jackson time to assemble their forces and to rally a defense. Okay, which they will do. Now, in the actual battle itself, we are going to see one of the truly most brilliant tactical maneuvers in U.S. military history, and it will demonstrate, this will be both Lee and Stonewall Jackson at their tactical finest. We've covered Hooker's plan. Now, Hooker outguns Lee by almost 2-1, okay? When Lee and Jackson see the army here under Sedgwick across at Fredericksburg and realize that Hooker's main thrust is going to come further west at Chancellorsville, they're in some trouble. That pins them between these two Union forces. They are going on the 2nd of May to decide upon a plan which is risky, which is a gamble, and which breaks all of the orthodox rules of tactical maneuver. They are facing a numerically superior force, and what they are going to do is divide their force. Okay? Now, if Hooker's vigilant, and if Hooker's paying attention to what's going on, he will see the division of the Confederate forces. He'll see Jackson swinging around to the south to come up from the west. And when he sees that, he'll have sufficient time to pounce on Lee. And if he can pounce on Lee with all of his forces, he'll crush Lee's inferior army, which will be outgunned almost 4-1. He then can bring these guys around to mop up, and Lee's army of Virginia will be defeated, and the war will end. Okay? But unfortunately, as is fairly typical in what we've seen before, the Union is suffering from overconfidence. Hooker believes that he has the tactical and strategic advantage because he has a superior force. And so he doesn't allow for this possibility. And there's not really consensual agreement among historians about what happens here in terms of Hooker's intelligence. There are those who say that, yes, some of Hooker's scouts did come back and tell him that Jackson was swinging south with about half the Confederate army. Okay? With the intention of appearing, swinging to the west and attacking. The rear guard was under the command of a guy by the name of Howard, and attacking Howard's forces in the rear and pinning, bracketing the Union army. And when Hooker heard this, he simply couldn't believe it, because Lee's too smart to divide his forces like this. Okay, Lee and Jackson are both tactical wizards. They're too smart to divide their forces when faced by a superior force. So Hooker just simply can't believe that they would do this. The other school of thought is that, in fact, there never was any report. Hooker just simply was not vigilant enough in his scouting and in his intelligence gathering, and Jackson was able to go through this woodlands by cover of dark, and on the morning of the 3rd, arrive here at Howard's rear. When he does so, either way, Howard's forces get thrown into panic immediately. They cannot contest the issue. They put up very little resistance, and for the most part, run headlong in panic mode, dropping their rifles in many cases into the main body of Hooker's army, spreading confusion throughout the ranks, at which point Lee presses in from the east. Hooker will manage to salvage his position and retreat northward to the river, leaving the Confederate army around them here, mostly under Jackson. Lee, for his part, will now move east because Sedgwick is going to try to cross the river, and they'll have two little bulges of Union armies, one here under Hooker, one here under Sedgwick around Fredericksburg. The one under Sedgwick will withdraw on the evening of the 3rd and under Hooker's orders, and Hooker will withdraw the same day, so that by May 4th, the contest is over, and the Confederates have held the field in an absolute feat of tactical wizardry. That brings us to the very famous and too often discussed Gettysburg campaign. Now, with the two successive tactical and strategic decisive victories against the Union, first at Fredericksburg, then at Chancellorsville, uh, from the fall of 62 through the spring of 63, Lee now believes that he's in a position to finish off the Army of the Potomac. He underestimates a little bit the Union's capacity to replenish its losses. Okay, that is, one of the things that we say is a critical comment about Lee is that he really underestimated how quickly the Union's going to be able to rally its forces and replenish its losses. He believes now, and this Gettysburg campaign is going to be a desperate. We're very close. The Gettysburg campaign, in many ways, is Lee throwing the Hail Mary pass. For those of you who understand that, because the fact of the matter is that by the middle of 63, it is now becoming clear to Lee that without foreign support that will rapidly materialize by the end of the year, the South will simply lose the war. They're bleeding to death. They cannot replenish, they cannot match the Union's capacity to replenish their forces and their supplies. And so Lee is now becoming desperate, and he's going to launch another campaign into the North. This time, instead of coming closer to D.C., where Antietam did, he's going to swing even further north, okay? Leaving Stuart, his main cavalry commander, to have a screen as he goes northward and feed him intelligence about Union forces. Lee's objective here is to move far enough north that the Army of the Potomac will have to spread itself out to defend the territory. He will then be able to turn and decisively defeat once and for all the Army of the Potomac. Okay? And with that defeat, maybe, hopefully, gather some foreign support. Okay? And as I say, it's a relatively desperate play for Lee. But we're now reaching the point where desperate times require desperate measures. Now, his intention is ultimately to draw the Army of the Potomac north and contest the issue with them somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania, south of Gettysburg. Okay? The Battle of Gettysburg itself is going to be largely a random chance meeting. As the two armies move closer and closer through northern Maryland and southeastern Pennsylvania, both armies, the Union Army under Hooker, the Confederate Army under Lee, are going to be scouting each other. Okay? Well, in a literally a scouting / foraging mission, okay, getting food together, things like that, two bodies of scouts are going to quite literally accidentally bump into each other north of the main armies at Gettysburg. Okay? Both sides believe that the opposing force is larger than it is there, and so they both come to the conclusion that the battle is on. The game is on here. Neither side really wants to contest the issue at Gettysburg. Tactically, it's not a good place to do this, okay? But throughout the first day of July 1st, the original meeting takes place in the morning. Okay, that's when the scouts originally bump into each other on July 1st. Throughout the day, both sides will continually reinforce that position in a very piecemeal way. Well, the Confederates will be faster. As we've seen before in the conflict, the Confederates generally outmaneuver the Union at every junction. And so here, too, they're going to outmaneuver the Union. And they're going to bring their main body to bear before the Union can get its full force there. Okay? And so on July 1st, they're going to be able to push at the Union. And the advantage is to the Confederacy. And what's going to happen by the end of day, the Union's going to string out like this, as you see here. And by the end of day, the Union right flank will completely collapse. The Union will be forced into a retreat south of Gettysburg, where they will take up a defensive position on the high ground south of Gettysburg. This is going to put Lee at a tactical disadvantage for the remainder of the battle, which will recommence on the 2nd. Lee's plan for the 2nd is a simple one. Okay, and we're going to see something. Who's going to come on the scene here, who we haven't talked about, is General George Meade. After the first day of the battle, Hooker will. There are those who say Hooker resigned. There are those who say Lincoln sent orders replacing Hooker. Okay, because Lincoln was not impressed with Hooker's command and orchestration of the Chancellorsville campaign and didn't really like Hooker. Now, one thing, I meant to mention this in Chancellorsville. While the Battle of Chancellorsville was a Confederate victory and a decisive one, ultimately something happens at Chancellorsville that is really, a lot of historians, or at least some historians, contend is what's ultimately going to cost the Confederacy the war, or at least be a significant reversal. On the evening of the 3rd, May 3rd at Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson will be leading a force of scouts doing reconnaissance, and he will be mistaken. It's mistaken identification, and Confederate forces will fire on him in the middle of the night. And so it's a friendly fire incident. He will end up being mortally wounded. They'll amputate his arm the next day, but about 6 days later, he's going to die of the complications, robbing the Confederacy of its greatest tactician, with the possible exception of Lee. And so Jackson is killed before the Battle of Gettysburg. Had Jackson been at the Battle of Gettysburg, things may have gone different. We never know. This is one of these historical what-ifs. But the loss of Jackson after Chancellorsville is a serious reversal for Lee. Now, back to, I meant to mention that when we were going over Chancellorsville. Now, back to the 2nd day of Gettysburg. Lee's plan for the 2nd day of Gettysburg is a simple one. The plan is the Union is commanding the high ground south of Gettysburg. The main Union force is in the center. The plan is that under Longstreet and under Ewell in the north, to pincer and attack both Union flanks. Okay? And collapse them inwards, encircling the Union Army, and, most importantly, cutting them off from support from the south, okay, and potential reinforcement. And this is what July 2nd will be devoted to. They will assault the positions over and over again. At one point in the left flank, Longstreet will actually break through, but he does so with insufficient force and is unable to maintain the position when Union reinforcements arrive. And the other thing that's kind of mysterious about this is this goes on all day in the south. On the left flank, Ewell doesn't really attack on the right flank until about 1800 hours, until 6 o'clock at night. Okay, and we don't know why he delayed his attack. Now, it's true that the Union had greater positional defenses up here, and so maybe that intimidated him, so he held off until he felt he had sufficient forces, or until he felt Longstreet had drawn away enough Union forces from the right flank. But at any rate, if they'd actually coordinated their assault, things may have been different. The other thing that Lee, how to say it, missed, underestimated, okay, misunderstood. Lee has gotten used to, we've seen it with McDowell, McClellan, Pope, Burnside, Hooker. Lee has been, in every case, the superior tactician. And so this is going to come back to haunt him here. He's assuming that Hooker is in command, and that as a result of this, he has a tactical superiority, that he's just simply a better commander. Okay? Well, that's not entirely true. We're now going to see the first, last, and only Union commander with genuine tactical military capability. Okay, competence. George Meade. George Meade will take over. After the first night, Hooker resigns, George Meade takes over command. And while I would not go so far as to say that Meade is Lee's tactical equal, certainly he's a much better match than the Union has presented yet. He is competent tactically. And to his credit, what he is going to be able to do for the entirety of the 2nd of July, as Lee continually, and under Longstreet, continually tries to break through the left flank, Meade is going to strip his center of its strength and reinforce his flanks. Okay? That's what's going to happen to Longstreet. At one point, Longstreet breaks through, but Meade reinforces the flank and drives him out. Okay? And to his credit, this is his advantage. I mean, if you go back with me to Fredericksburg, look at Burnside. Burnside just continually sent brigade after brigade after brigade against Marye's Heights, and every one of them came back devastated, losing 50% of their strength. Burnside failed to adjust to battlefield conditions. He failed to adjust to this tactical reality that Lee's position was unassailable there and figure something out. He couldn't do that. He just stuck to the plan. And he would have done it again on the 13th if his commanders hadn't prevailed upon him and convinced him that it was futile. Look at Hooker at Chancellorsville. Same thing. He could not adjust to the tactical realities presented to him by Lee and Jackson. Okay, so he maintained his adhesion to this plan of his, which obviously wasn't going to work. Well, Meade isn't like that. He adjusts very rapidly with actually a certain cat-like reflex to what Lee is doing and reinforces those flanks, okay, which carries the day on the 2nd. Now, when it comes to the final day, Lee has correctly, in many ways, correctly assessed what Meade has been able to do. He's correctly assessed that what Meade has done is strip his center and send reinforcements to the flanks. This leads to a rather obvious, but ultimately foolhardy strategy on the 3rd of July. Lee's plan now is to launch a full frontal assault against the Union center, hoping to break through and encircle the left flank. Okay? Simultaneously coming against the Union right flank and pinning it down. On paper, it makes sense. However, there are a couple of problems with it. One, this is the main Union artillery. Two, Lee is again underestimating Meade's capacity to adjust to battlefield circumstances. Lee is assuming that Meade has not been reinforced and that his center is now stripped of most of its strength in reinforcing the flanks on the 2nd of July. Well, Meade has reversed that. Meade has brought a lot of his strength back to the center, and throughout the night of the 2nd and 3rd, he's reinforced from the south. And so Meade now has a considerable force in his center. Lee's idea is to soften them up in the morning with an artillery barrage against the Union center position. The problem is that the Confederate gunners overshoot their target. They cause confusion in the Union ranks, to be sure, but not sufficient damage to soften them up for a full frontal assault. Now, at this point, Longstreet tries to convince Lee that it's just not going to work. Okay? There's insufficient strength. We have to think something else through, okay, to continue the campaign or withdraw from the position. They've already successfully inflicted a lot of casualties. And that's why we say if Stonewall Jackson had still been alive and present at this battle, it's a personal relationship, okay? Lee understood Longstreet's competence and understood Ewell's competence, okay, but he did not have this, Lee did not have the same respect for them that he did for Stonewall Jackson. Lee's respect for Stonewall largely came from the Valley Campaign. Lee was very impressed with how he did that. Okay? So if Jackson had been there and said, look, Bobby, speaking to Robert E. Lee, Bobby, buddy, this ain't going to work. Okay? They have too much strength there. We are not going to be able to break through, and we are going to lose thousands, which we can ill afford to lose. We have to think something else out. Okay? Move further south and attack from the south. Whatever. Who knows? Outflank them. Something. But instead, Longstreet tries to convince Lee that this isn't going to work, and Lee says, shut up and do as you're told. Okay? Longstreet says, whatever. He says, my commander told me to assault this position, and I'm going to do it. And so repeatedly through the 3rd, he continues to throw forces. This is the famous, Pickett's charge. Pickett is only one of several units, but Pickett's charge. They charge against Union artillery with severe losses over and over and over, and ultimately are unable to continue the battle. And so the day is carried by the Union. This is the first time we've seen a tactical victory. And it is entirely the responsibility of George Meade. To give the, we've really dissed and criticized the Union commanders to date, so we would be doing a disservice to George Meade if we were to do that with him and lump him in with the rest of those lunkheads, including one that we're going to see here in a minute, Ulysses S. Grant. Okay? He was tactically very good. Maybe not Lee's match, but certainly better than the others. And, maybe he is Lee's match because he certainly carried the day on this day. Lee will now be forced to withdraw from Gettysburg. Okay. Now, just kind of, I'll handle this on this slide rather than go to the next one. Now, this presents Meade with a problem. Not a military problem, a political problem. Okay? With our friend Abe. The news from the Battle of Gettysburg gets back to Abe Lincoln, and Abe Lincoln thinks, finally, we've won a victory. Okay? We now have the Confederacy on the run. He wants Meade to pursue with great vigor Lee's army. He wanted Burnside to do the same thing. Okay? Which ultimately leads to Fredericksburg. Okay? And the disaster there. And Chancellorsville. And the disaster there. He wants Meade to do the same thing, pursue Lee's retreating army, and once and for all destroy the Army of Virginia. Meade says, Abe, buddy, once again, you're underestimating Robert E. Lee and his capacity to rally his forces. Okay? He's been defeated in the battle. His army is not beaten. They still are a considerable force. If we over-pursue, we are going to fall into a trap, and we're going to have another Fredericksburg. And so Meade refuses to do it. He scouts Lee's retreat. They offer some skirmishing engagements in southern Pennsylvania and northern Maryland, kind of more or less prodding Lee along to move his army south. But he refuses to engage him with any kind of force. At which point, of course, Abe Lincoln goes crazy. And once again, in this revolving door, relieves Meade. Okay? That brings us to the Overland Campaign. Here's the problem. Lee's bullpen, or Lincoln's bullpen, is getting pretty weak. Okay, it's getting pretty thin. Well, who'd we start with? McDowell. He replaced him with McClellan. Then he replaced him back with McDowell. Then we had Pope briefly. Then we had Burnside. Then Hooker. Then Meade. He's only got so many pitchers in his bullpen, to use a baseball reference. Okay, so now he's out of relief commanders. Okay, and so he plunks out of the West, and we'll cover the West here in a minute. Okay, in probably the third part of this. This is going to go to a third part, obviously, and we're going to cover the West then. And we'll only briefly cover the West. He's going to pull Ulysses S. Grant, for whom Lincoln has no affection. He thinks Grant is generally incompetent and a drunk and a thug, okay, and a classless boob. But he's out of options. And the one thing that he's seen from Grant in the West, Grant is utterly and completely indifferent to casualties. He couldn't care less how many men he loses. Okay? And we'll see why that's true when we get to the West. Okay? In terms of tactical ability, he has none to speak of. In terms of strategic ability, not very much. But he is a son of a bitch. Okay? He is a thug and a brute. And that's what Lincoln wants. We are now in 1864. The Confederacy by now is slowly but surely bleeding to death. Foreign support, obviously, at this point, is never going to materialize. Okay? So Lincoln, or between Lincoln and Grant, they will now develop what's known as the Overland or Wilderness Campaign. Okay? And this is yet another frontal assault. The idea is march straight through Virginia, take Richmond, end the war. Now, in the initial engagement, way up north, south of Fredericksburg, once again, understand something, this is the 5th time that they've engaged in this area. Once again, Lee, outnumbered better than 2-1 by Grant, will outmaneuver Grant and tactically defeat him. Now, up until now, and this is going to be the difference, this is Ulysses S. Grant, up until now, this has been the pattern. This is a familiar pattern beginning in 1861 with the First Battle of Manassas. What happens after the tactical defeat for the Union? Okay, they retreat back north, rally their forces, lick their wounds, marshal more forces, and try it again. Over and over and over. Not Grant. Grant doesn't care. Okay, Grant couldn't care less how many eggs he got to break to make this omelet. He's going to make it, no matter what. And so rather than retreating his army north, he just simply moves east and then marches south again, forcing Lee to match him. And at each engagement, Lee outmaneuvers him tactically, inflicts heavier losses than he receives, and in each case, Grant simply moves further east and turns south again, further east and turns south again. The problem is, and Lee understands this at this point, Lee at this point knows that his cause is becoming progressively or degeneratively desperate. Okay? Grant can replenish these losses. He's losing in every engagement by almost 2-1. He's getting his ass kicked. But it doesn't matter. He can replenish his forces. There are lots and lots. You know what he's replenishing them with? He's replenishing them with the poor. We'll deal with that, okay? During the war, Lincoln institutes the first conscription, the first draft. Only it's a little bit different. Because for $300, you can buy yourself out of the draft in the North. And so the only people fighting are the people that can't afford to buy themselves out of the draft. So it's all the poor, mostly the unemployed, mostly Irish immigrants. Grant doesn't care. They're cannon fodder to him. Throw them into the Confederacy will eventually simply run out of bullets. It's that simple. Okay? Well, Lee's beginning to realize this too. He cannot replenish his forces like Grant can. And so in this series, in this campaign of attrition, Grant just eventually keeps moving south, wearing Lee down. He never does take Richmond. He moves further south to attack the rail yards at Petersburg. Lee, now with his forces diminished to less than 50% of Grant's, okay, has no options. His only option is to try to move further west and link up with Johnston's retreating army, Johnston's retreating in the face of Sherman in his famous march to the sea and taking of Atlanta. March west, link up with Johnston and hope to defeat Grant in a final battle. Okay? The problem is that Johnston is being relentlessly driven south by Sherman, okay, who we'll deal with when we get to the west. And so when Lee moves further and further west, he realizes he's never going to be able to link up with Johnston. His army is bleeding to death. He is now faced at a point where they are not supplied. They have very little ammunition, generally less than 10 or 20 rounds per man. They're wearing rags. Okay, they have nothing left to fight with. At which point he sues for peace with Grant. He says, "You know what? We've done the best we can. It's over. There's nothing left. I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing left to fight with." Okay, and this will be in the spring of '65, and that will end the war at Appomattox Courthouse. And we'll conclude this one here, and pick up. We'll finish things off with, I hope, what's probably going to be a shorter PowerPoint in part 3.